Chapter 1. The Daydreamer. The sun set over the farmlands outside the small village of Flaxton, casting rich beams of golden light across the southern Destian plains as Eva Thirsk stood atop a parked wagon, straining her eyes to watch the skies. "Come on, where are you?" she muttered under her breath, lifting a hand to block out the setting sun and scanning the clouds that surrounded it. She was sure she'd caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, but by the time she'd climbed up high enough to get a good look, she'd lost track of it. The sky began to darken, and Ava bit back her disappointment at missing her chance to see them. But then, right as she was about to climb back down from the wagon, the clouds moved aside, and the last beam of sunlight lit up the sky in a burst of color and silhouetted the dark shapes in the sky. "Yes!" Ava exclaimed, jumping up even higher and balancing on the seat of the wagon as she soaked in the sight. 3 magnificent dragons, soaring leisurely across the sky. Ava watched them as long as she could, memorizing each steady beat of their wings and the gleam of the light reflecting off their shining scales before they disappeared behind the clouds once more. She lived for moments like this, when she got to see a peek of life beyond the little village she called home. The dragons didn't fly this far south very often. Ava had to savor the moment while she could.
"What are you doing?"
The intruding voice cut through Ava's reverie, and she whirled around to face the source, almost losing her balance on the wagon as she did so. The speaker was Lane, one of Danwell's grandchildren, and a cousin of sorts. At her near slip, the older boy rolled his eyes and let out a scoff. He was always quick to scoff. I was just finishing my chores." Ava got out, though she knew the lie wouldn't be believed. Her cheeks warmed in embarrassment at being caught goofing off, and she chided herself as she jumped down from the wagon, careful to hold down her skirt so as to avoid accidentally letting Lane see the strange diamond-shaped birthmark on her leg. It was bad enough to have him catch her shirking her chores. She didn't want to deal with having him make fun of her birthmark too, something he'd always known she was self-conscious about.
"You were daydreaming again,"
he accused, crossing his thin arms over his chest and looking down at her with narrowed eyes.
"Honestly, Ava, it's like you're incapable of doing even the simplest of jobs."
"I wasn't daydreaming. I was simply distracted."
"What's the difference?"
Lane dismissed with a frown.
"You should have finished with the chores 10 minutes ago, and here you are dawdling and gaping at the sky. Dragon watching again, yeah? When are you gonna give that up? What, do you think they'll come down here and carry you off into the sunset? The dragons don't care that you exist, unless they're looking to make a meal out of you."
"Dragons don't eat," Ava started, before cutting herself off. It wouldn't matter to Lane what dragons did. He only cared about the things that happened on the ground. "I mean, that's not what I was thinking."
"Right."
Lane rolled his eyes again, clearly not buying it.
"Well, no dragon riders have ever come from Flaxton, or from any peasant for that matter, and the family needs you here on the ground, so stop slacking and get the horses unharnessed and wiped down."
The order given, the older boy turned and strode off back toward the farmhouse.
"It would go faster if you helped me,"
Ava called after him.
"You would already be finished if you actually did your chores when you're supposed to,"
Lane said back over his shoulder, not bothering to slow his walk,
"instead of daydreaming about flying away."
Ava sighed as she went into the barn, where the 2 old farm horses, Walnut and Arrow, were patiently waiting for her. "All right, let's get this all taken off for you," she said to the 2 animals, as she undid the various belts and buckles that harnessed them to the old equipment. Ava had completed this task so many times over the years that she could do it with her eyes closed. Sure fingers found the worn grooves in the sturdy leather and brushed against the warm metal. "And then we'll get you wiped down and fed for the night. How does that sound?" She reached up and rested her hand against Walnut's snout for a moment, the horse giving her a gentle gaze as if he understood her. She smiled as she removed the noseband and bit attached to the reins, before the interaction with Lane pulled at the back of her mind and she sobered. "It's like he misunderstands me on purpose," she sighed. "Like he thinks I want to abandon the family just because I like to watch the dragons pass by." Walnut shook out his mane once freed from the bridle, letting out another contented snort and stamping his hooves a couple of times against the ground. It almost felt like he was huffing on Ava's behalf, like he knew Lane was being ridiculous. Ava chuckled, petting Walnut's snout once more before moving to take care of Arrow. She made quick work of it, freeing Arrow of his bit and bridle before leading the two horses into their pens. With her admittedly late start, she had to hurry through their grooming and feeding, which only made her scold herself more. Caring for the horses was perhaps her favorite thing to do here on the farm. And although she didn't have to take her time to do a good job at it, she always wanted to make it last as long as possible. The house would be a den of noise and mayhem, overflowing with children playing and adults complaining, and everyone bustling around to get dinner on the table, scolding Ava for being late as usual. Lane would no doubt have reported back to them that he'd caught her dragon watching again, and the rest of the family seemed to take his dim view of it. They all seemed to think that the only reason Ava might have for being interested in the beasts was a secret desire to leave them behind. And no matter how much she might try to explain, they just couldn't or wouldn't understand. No one was ever unkind to her, of course, but since Danwell had passed, she'd just felt left out. Although he had already been an old man when he'd adopted Ava at age 5, Danwell and his wife had always treated her kindly, loved her, or so she liked to believe. But Danwell's wife, Hannah, had died 2 years ago, when Ava was 14, and now Danwell was gone too. The rest of the family still cared for Ava, she knew that, but she couldn't shake the feeling, the unwelcome certainty in the back of her mind that she didn't belong. Not cut from the same cloth, or so she'd once heard, the comment coming from one of the people in the town when they'd thought she couldn't hear. Not a real part of the family, not a real Thirsk. It was silly to let those thoughts linger in her head. They weren't true, but no matter how insistently she told herself that, she still couldn't help but think it sometimes. And having Lane make his snide comments about thinking she wanted to fly away made her feel even worse. She couldn't stay in the barn forever, though. With Walnut and Arrow secure in their pens, sufficiently wiped down, and eating their oats in bliss and contentment, it was time for Ava to go in for supper herself. The sun had fully gone down when she stepped back outside. The brisk air of a spring dusk chilled Ava's arms, but the glow of orange light spilling out of the windows of the old farmhouse invited her into its warmth. Pushing open the back door, Ava stepped into the kitchen, breathing in the rich scent of beef and garlic and rosemary that drifted over from the stew simmering away on the hearth. "Oh, look who finally decided to show up," huffed Karina. The woman glanced up at Ava as she pulled a tray of golden rolls from the wood fire oven. "What took you so long with your chores? I've been working in here for hours getting supper ready for everyone, when I have other things that need doing, and I could have used your help." The woman, in her mid-40s, was Danwell's oldest child, and as such had inherited the farm, though all his children lived and worked here. When Ava had first been adopted, Karina had called herself Ava's big sister. despite the large gap in their ages. But with all Danwell's grandkids, the oldest of whom was Lane, a year older than Ava, calling her mother or aunt, it hadn't been long before Ava had fallen into the habit of calling the woman Aunt Karina herself, and calling the other kids cousins. And as she'd grown older, something had seemed to shift, until the question of how to refer to the many members of the Thirsk family had fallen by the wayside. And now the woman was simply Karina. Perhaps it was Ava's imagination, but the farther away she got from sister, the more distant Karina seemed to be. When Hannah had died, the gulf had seemed to widen, and now, with Danwell gone, it all felt even worse. Ava tried to tell herself that they just needed time, that Karina was simply stressed from taking over the farm, and the whole family was having a hard time adjusting to the gaping hole once filled by Danwell's presence. But just like the unwelcome thought that told Ava she wasn't a real Thirsk, it was hard to shake the idea that Karina wasn't her real sister, or aunt, or whatever she might otherwise have been. Ava knew it was illogical. She knew it wasn't true. But logic didn't magically change your feelings, and her feelings told her she was alone. Karina let out a deep sigh, setting the bread aside and rubbing at her temples as if she had a headache, before turning back to the stove. "So it's the silent treatment, then?" Ava bit her lip, realizing that she should have responded by now, and had got lost in her thoughts instead. "Sorry, Karina," she said quietly. "I wasn't thinking." "No, you weren't," Karina sighed, though seemed ready to drop the subject now as she picked up a letter from the table. "Now, mind the fire for me. I have to go to town." "Go to town?" Ava repeated. "But it's past nightfall." "Yes, and I could be back by now if you had come in from the stables earlier," Karina said. "I have to collect the docket at the Guildhall. It's nearly collection day, and I need to know how much produce we're due to hand over to the army this month." "I could go get it," Ava offered, eager for the chance to redeem herself. "I'll run the whole way, to make up for lost time." Karina paused, giving her a narrow-eyed look. "You won't get distracted?" Ava shook her head. "I'll be back by the time supper's on the table," she promised. "All right." Karina handed over the notice from the Guildhall. "If you're late, we won't wait for you." "I won't be late." Ava stepped out of the kitchen and back into the twilight. She wasted no time in setting off at a run down the old dirt road towards the village of Flaxton. It was a lovely night for a run, and Ava relished the activity. There was something magical about the feeling she got when she ran. Something strong, powerful, freeing. It might not be flight, but it was fast. And in a sleepy little place like Flaxton, which often moved as slowly as molasses, fast was as good as she'd get. She didn't slow down until she reached the outskirts of the village. She took a moment to catch her breath, then hurried towards the center of town. "Ava?" She glanced around to see Lila, an old schoolmate, exiting one of the nearby cottages. "What are you doing in town so late?" "Oh, hello, Lila," Ava panted as her friend closed the distance between them. "I'm going to the Guildhall to get the docket for She cut herself off halfway through the word father, a lump suddenly catching in her throat. She hurriedly swallowed it back down. "For Karina," she amended. "I'll go with you," Lila offered. "That is, if you don't mind the company." Ava shook her head, trying for a small smile. "I don't mind. It would be nice to have some company for the short walk. Besides, it had been a while since she'd seen Lila. For farm kids like her, schooling ended at age 15, and she rarely had reason to come into town anymore. "I'm glad," Lila told her, smiling back and falling into step beside her. Despite the darkening night, the village was aglow with warm light, staining out onto the road from the windows of the cottages they passed by, and casting shadows from the oil lamp light posts overhead. "How have you been lately?" Since Danwell died hung in the air, even if it was unspoken. Ava thought of brushing her off with a generic "I'm fine," but then caught herself. She felt like she had to talk to someone, anyone, or the things she'd been feeling would eat her from the inside out. And here Lila was, as if by fate. "It's been difficult on the farm," she admitted to her quietly. "Karina is working very hard, trying to run the farm and the family, and everyone's doing their part to help, but I don't know." She sighed, absently kicking aside a pebble in her path. "I don't think I'm doing it right." "What do you mean?" Ava shrugged a shoulder. "Sometimes I just feel—" She paused, glancing up at the starlit sky, as she tried to think of the right word to describe the heaviness she felt. "Tired. Not actually physically tired, but listless. Like I'm trying to wade through water against a current. Does that make sense?" Lila rubbed at the back of her neck, glancing at Ava sympathetically, but somehow looking less understanding than the horses. "That must be difficult," she said, after a few minutes of searching for a reply. Ava managed a half smile. It was kind of the girl to try to be understanding. "It can be," she agreed. "It actually sounds like something my brother used to say," Lila continued. "I think that's why he joined the military. He loves our family, but our life here seemed to fit too tight. He needed more space to breathe." Yes, Ava thought. That. It made her feel a little better to know that she wasn't the only one who couldn't help dreaming of a bigger life, a bigger future than Flaxton could offer. Maybe now she could stop feeling so guilty for her ingratitude. After all, Flaxton had given her a home and a family after her birth parents had abandoned her as a young child. She should be happy here, should want to be here with the people who had taken her in and raised her. And yet, she'd never quite felt like this was where she was supposed to be. "Have you heard from your brother recently?" Ava asked, wanting to shift the conversation to something that would make Lila more comfortable. "Oh, yes. We had a letter from Jayan just the other day." "And how is he liking the military?" "He's enjoying it very much," Lila said. "Now that he's done with his training, he's been stationed in a village in Sima, along the border. He doesn't see much combat, thank heavens, but he says he's been hard at work helping to rebuild the village and keep guard, in case of more raids." Ava's interest sparked, as always happened when she heard news from Sima. She couldn't be certain, but she believed she was from there, originally. In the 12 years since the border disputes had begun, many families had fled from the heavily contested region. Her parents could have easily been among them. She often found herself wondering if they were still out there somewhere, looking for a place to call home. Maybe if they ever did, they would send for her. But after all this time, it was foolish to hope that they would come back for her, that they were still alive. "He says the region is impoverished," Lila continued. "There has been so much destruction, so much death. I fear for Jayan's safety, facing danger like that. But I'm also so proud of him. We all are." Soon, they reached the town square, which was bustling. The tavern appeared crowded, of course. The sounds of laughing and talking while someone played the fiddle flowed out from the open windows. Elsewhere in the square, the last few shops were closing for the night, and the Guildhall, easily the largest and grandest building in the small village, with its heavy beams and ornate wooden carvings, still had its heavy polished oak doors open for the people who, like Ava, couldn't visit it during the day. She and Lila entered the tall building only to see that the place was busier than usual, thanks to a contingent of Destian foot soldiers. It was rare to have any kind of military presence out here in Flaxton, but Ava was relieved to see that they didn't look to be here on any serious business. They lounged casually at one of the tables, talking and laughing as they sipped at mugs of ale and chatted among themselves. Ava and Lila skirted around the group as they made their way towards Betta, the only clerk still on duty. Ava pulled the notice from her pocket and set it on the counter. "Docket for Thirsk Farms, please." "Ah, I was wondering when one of you would show up," Betta, the clerk, said, turning to rifle through her files behind the counter. "How's your family?" "Doing well, thank you." "Glad to hear it," Betta said as she handed Ava the docket, offering her a small smile. "We were all saddened to lose Danwell, but it's good to have lots of family around. Helps you move past the grieving." The remark had clearly been said with kind intent, but it made her feel distinctly uncomfortable. Maybe because she felt more stifled than supported by her adopted family, who were content to spend their lives on the farm, while Ava wanted adventure. She shifted her weight as she tucked the docket into her pouch, trying to put the strange comment out of her mind as she nodded stiffly. "Yes, of course," she muttered. "Good night." She turned, beginning to walk back towards the door, but as she passed the table of soldiers, they called out to her and Lila.
"You two from the farms outside town?"
asked one man, a burly figure with a pale gray mustache and wrinkles in the corner of his dark eyes. She is," Lila said, indicating Ava. "I live here in town."
"We didn't see you here earlier today."
Lila shrugged. "I didn't have reason to come to the guild hall earlier, I suppose. Why?"
"Well, as it happens, we are here in town looking for strong young men and women with a taste for honor and adventure," said the man, turning towards them more fully as he looked them over. "How about you? Ever consider what you could do for Destia?"
"Oh, we're not old enough to enlist," Lila said awkwardly. "We're just 16. And besides, I don't know anything about fighting. My parents are greengrocers."
16 is a perfectly respectable age to begin your training," spoke another man. "That's how old I was when I began, and I've never looked back."
"And if you aren't suited for combat, there are lots of other jobs to take in the army," a dark-haired woman added. "It's not all swordplay and dragon riding, you know. We also need squires, cooks, messengers, flag-bearers. There's room for all sorts. Anyone who joins has the joy of knowing they're helping their country. Plus, it allows you to travel, see the world outside this little town, eh?" It did sound tempting. Not as tempting and certainly not as glamorous as dragon riding, of course, but Ava wasn't a child. She knew that particular dream wasn't going to come true for her. You needed magic to bond with a dragon, and inborn magic was vanishingly rare outside of a collection of old, noble families who had it in their blood. In theory, anyone could be born with magic, but she was certain that no one in Flaxton ever had been. Not to mention, it was too late in her case. The powers generally manifested around age 13. Back then, she had hoped she might wake up one day with the ability to manipulate water or fire or earth or air. But it had never happened, and now it never would. She would not be able to bond with a dragon, no matter how much she longed to. But there were other options for her in the army. She could work, she could serve her country, and maybe she could even travel to Sema and search for any trace of her birth family, her history. She had always wished to be a part of something bigger. Would she find that in the military? Did she dare to try?
"Ah, there's nothing like the feeling of pride that comes with this line of work, girl," the mustached man was saying loudly. "It's thanks to the people at the front that villages like this flourish. It does my heart good to be here, to sit in this fine hall and taste this good ale and talk to upstanding young people like yourself. Makes the work I've done feel truly meaningful."
"And the pay's not bad either," joked a third soldier, a young woman with hay-colored hair pulled out of her face in a ponytail that looked oddly messy and windblown compared to her otherwise neat appearance, as if she hadn't bothered to brush it since that morning. The soldier's words seemed to echo her own thoughts. Truly meaningful. That was what Ava wanted for her own life. She wanted to do something important. She wanted her life to mean something. She wanted to look back on her life and be proud of the things she'd accomplished. And that was never going to happen working in the fields and tending horses.